Welcome to the 17th of December edition of the Jane's World of Defence podcast. With me today, I have Nick Forenza, JDW's Europe editor, Gabriel Dominguez, our Asia Pacific editor, and Jeremy Binney, our Middle East and Africa editor. Now, recently, we've just done our mother of all features, what we call the Jane's Annual Defence Report. I'm not going to go through that in detail here because we've done a whole webinar about that. And if you are a subscriber, you can download that from the Jane's website. But when we kicked off the ADR, in the introduction, one of the points we were making was this was the 70th anniversary year of NATO. And to be honest, they could have had a better year. We've had all kinds of arguments about funding with regard to Trump demanding more of the European NATO allies. We've had problems with Turkey and what they're procuring and whether it's compatible with NATO or not, to the extent they have now been kicked out of the F-35 program for buying S-400 air defense systems. And of course, we came to the final, well, what was it, Nick? They didn't call it a summit, did they? What did they call the meeting?
Called it the NATO Leaders meeting because they said it wasn't a full-fledged summit because normally a summit would also include meetings with non-NATO countries, for example, countries that want to become members of the alliance. So Ukraine would be coming to a summit, for example, and was not in London. On the other hand, Northern Macedonia was at the meeting because it is an invitee and it has the right to sit at the table with the other countries, but without voting powers until it becomes a member, which is expected in the next few months, I suppose.
Okay. I mean, I got the impression, though, moving into this meeting, as opposed to summit, that NATO was almost worried about how things would transpire at that event, whether Trump would kick off about something, whether the Turks would remain insistent that they simply would not back the NATO plan to defend the Baltics and Poland if NATO didn't come on board with its attitude to the Kurds in Syria. So, what happened in the end? What happened at that meeting in the end? What kind of progress was there?
Well, in fact, the meeting could have been much worse. I mean, there was no problem with Trump. He seemed to be happy that allies are increasing their defense spending, even though not all of them are going to reach 2% in the next couple of years, which is the NATO target. But still, he was able to take credit for countries actually stepping up. NATO countries will spend hundreds of millions of euros more on defense over the next few years. So, I mean, there is actually some progress in this area. And also, NATO approved the readiness initiative. I personally was skeptical that they would be able to meet by 2020 the target of being able to provide 30 battalions, 30 warships, and 30 squadrons of combat aircraft ready within 30 days by 2020. But they did meet that target.
There was talk of discussion of China and to what extent NATO should be engaging with China, considering China a major threat. What was said about that?
Well, China is clearly outside the Euro-Atlantic area, but still there are worries among allies of its impact on security in the area covered by the NATO treaty. What happened was leaders approved a new report, which has been prepared over the last few months, looking at the challenges that China poses, not just militarily, but also economically on Euro-Atlantic security. And this is quite revolutionary for NATO because, of course, in the past, Russia was the threat. And then, of course, there have been out-of-area operations of the last few decades, notably in Afghanistan. But no one really has been looking at China in this way. The NATO Secretary General actually, during the press conference, and in fact, there was a conference the day before called NATO Engages. He specifically said that Chinese ICBMs can reach not only North America, but of course, Europe. He was also saying that the intermediate range missiles, the hundreds of these missiles that China has, would normally not have been allowed by the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. But of course, that INF treaty only covered Europe, and now, of course, it's defunct. But the fact of the matter is these kinds of intermediate missiles are also a threat to not only Europe coming from Russia, but also at least one a NATO ally, the United States, in its presence in the Pacific.
And lastly, what about Turkey? Former bastion of NATO's southern flank, now somewhat problem-charred within the alliance. They stepped down, as I mentioned, from that threat to veto that NATO plan for defending the Baltics and Poland. Where do you see the NATO relationship with Turkey going in the next year?
It's very difficult to say because Turkey was anticipated as being one of the big spoilers of the meeting, and that did not actually happen. They did not block NATO plans to defend the Baltic states and Poland. They have been making some noises lately again about closing Incirlik and other bases, but on the other hand, they're continuing to prepare to continue to be NATO member. For example, they're getting ready to lead the very high readiness joint task force in 2021, if I'm not mistaken. And also from the other side, NATO is still providing security. For example, the Spaniards are going to keep their Patriot missiles in eastern Turkey, which means that there is this NATO solidarity. I think.
So is there a disconnect then between the Turkish political leadership, Erdogan, and the Turkish military, who are still very much NATO on side as allies?
The military has changed quite a bit, especially after being purged.
After the purge.
But I guess there still is this interest in cooperating with NATO allies, and obviously from the NATO point of view, I think there is this attempt to placate the Turks. I mean, the Turkey does provide major military capabilities, and I think there still is this attempt to see how, despite Turkey buying S-400s and being kicked out of the Joint Strike Fighter program, still keeping it as a NATO ally. I mean, obviously, if they did not succeed in doing this, the geopolitical situation in southeastern Europe would be completely changed.
Okay, Nick, thanks very much. Okay, now on to Gabriel, and we've got a couple of things to discuss here. Firstly, the North Koreans, Gabriel. We've had a couple of tests. They haven't said what they are. They've said they're very important. We've been told by the South Koreans, for example, that these are actually engine tests, either satellite launch vehicle or missile engine tests. And of course, that's very convenient because we can't see engine tests happening. The North Koreans know what they're doing here. They're ratcheting up the pressure as they come to the end of their self-declared moratorium on doing big and bad tests in relation to ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons. What else do we know from what the South Koreans have said and what we can garner from the cryptic messages coming out of Pyongyang?
Well, that's right, Peter. On the 14th and on the 8th of September, North Korea announced that it had conducted what it described as very important and crucial tests at its Sohae satellite launch station, which serves both as the country's main satellite launch facility as well as a missile engine test site. I think there are two interesting things to point out here. The first one is that they come, as you pointed out, only weeks before Pyongyang's self-imposed deadline on denuclearization talks with the United States. This deadline is set to expire, by January 1st, 2020. And Pyongyang has already warned that it is entirely up to the United States what Christmas gift it will select to get from Pyongyang, which has been interpreted as a possible indication that North Korea is ready to conduct more ICBM or nuclear tests. The other thing that I think it's interesting here is that we are yet to see any imagery of these tests. Given where these tests have been conducted, it is reasonable to assume that these are rocket engine tests. But the only confirmation in this regard has come so far from the South Korean defense minister, as you've pointed out. North Korea itself has provided no details whatsoever, making it difficult to determine the type, the dimensions, and the capabilities of such a rocket engine. I think it's therefore not entirely clear whether this engine, for instance, is liquid or solid fueled, how much thrust it is capable of generating, or whether it's meant to launch a satellite or an ICBM.
Okay, so we can't really tell whether it's actually for a missile or a satellite launch vehicle. Obviously, the technology is similar, but there are slight differences, aren't there, in how you would test lengths of burns, that kind of thing. Can we extrapolate anything from any of that?
Well, I think the answer is that we don't know for sure exactly what that engine is for, as very few details have emerged. That said, it appears that it is an engine that will be part of a strategic weapon system, possibly designed to carry a nuclear warhead. One indication of this was given to us in a 14 December announcement made by Pak Yong-chung, who is the chief of the General Staff of the Korean People's Army. In that statement, he said that the priceless data, and I quote, "The priceless data, experience, and new technologies gained in the recent test of defense science and research will be fully applied to the development of another strategic weapon of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea for definitely and reliably restraining and overpowering the nuclear threat of the United States." Those are his words. And he also said that genuine peace can only be safeguarded and North Korea's future be guaranteed when, quote unquote, the balance of power is completely ensured. So in my view, I think we're definitely talking here about an ICBM.
Okay. Now let's move on to China, because we've had a much anticipated event. We've been waiting around for this to happen for the last couple of weeks. And finally, we have it, the commissioning of the plan's second aircraft carrier. So what do we know about that so far? What's it called, first of all?
Yes, the name is Shandong, and Shandong is the Navy's second and China's first locally built aircraft carrier. It was commissioned on 17th December at the Sanya Yuling Naval Base on Hainan Island, and the event was very important for both the Chinese Navy and the country in general, as you can tell from the presence of Chinese President Xi Jinping at the ceremony.
Okay, so this is Hainan Island, so is that its area of operation in that particular part of the world?
Yes, that's where we expect it to operate. I think it's going to be used in the South China Sea. I mean, although it will be geographically co-located with the naval forces of the Southern Theater Command, which is also known as the South Sea Fleet, the carrier may be under direct command of the Central Military Commission because of its perceived strategic value. That said, we do expect it to be operating in the South China Sea, yes.
Okay. Well, that is interesting, because we know the Chinese have been building airstrips on various reefs and various outlets and island creating, basically, to provide airstrips in the South China Sea. But now they'll have a mobile one that they can put pretty much anywhere they want in that region.
That is true. They'll have those capabilities available pretty much in the whole area.
Okay. Now, this is the first Chinese-built carrier, yes? So where's the difference between that and the first one, Liaoning?
Well, the carrier was built to broadly the same design as Liaoning, which was formerly the Kuznetsov-class carrier called Variak. However, a number of modifications are evident in Shandong that are likely to reflect the knowledge gained by China from operating Liaoning, as well as the Chinese Navy's concept of carrier operations, which is definitely different from that of the former Soviet Navy. For instance, the missiles, which were launched from below the flight deck, were removed from the former Variak aircraft carrier before entering service with the plan as Liaoning. The construction of Shandong from scratch will have facilitated a better internal compartment layout, which may have resulted in an increase of the size of the hangar. A more obvious change, in my view, is in the superstructure, which has a revised layout providing 2 bridge levels. Moreover, the overall length of the island has been reduced by about 10 meters, thus allowing for improved aircraft handling on the flight deck and possibly for an additional aircraft parking spot. I think in terms of capabilities, China's state broadcaster CCTV had previously reported that design changes will allow Shandong to embark 36 J-15 aircraft, which is about a 50% increase compared to Liaoning. These are claims that other Chinese media outlets have repeated. However, it seems very unlikely that design changes alone would permit such a massive increase in the number of aircraft embarked, unless, of course, the the assessed number of 12 embarked helicopters has been reduced. And I think last but not least, one of the most notable modifications in Shandong is the fact that the Type 346 phased array radar has been upgraded with flat array panels installed on the superstructure quadrants rather than the 4 aft and athwart ships as in Liaoning.
Right. It's one thing to have an aircraft carrier, but then you've got to be able to operate it, and that requires a whole fleet of ships to actually protect it, to give anti-submarine cover, air defense cover. So can we say what the carrier group around Shandong will look like? I mean, is it like an American mold? Is it more of a Russian setup? What do we know about how they're assembling that carrier group, which they're now going to have to go out and start exercising with to work up this capability, make it something real?
Well, we expect Shandong to be protected by a group of escorts to provide anti-air, anti-submarine, and anti-ship capabilities. The South Sea Fleet is thought to have already received 5 Type of 52D destroyers and at least 10 Type of 54A frigates, which can deliver pretty much all of these capabilities. Furthermore, the larger 10,000-ton Type of 55 destroyers, 5 of which have been already launched, can be expected to provide the lead escort in future carrier task groups. But as I said before, very little information has emerged about how the Chinese Navy intends to use its growing fleet of aircraft carriers operationally. But I think it's important to point out here that photographs have emerged of J-15 aircraft carrying PL-8 and PL-12 air-to-air missiles, as well as YJ-83K and YJ-91K anti-ship missiles. And this suggests to me that the carrier's primary role will be fleet defense against both air and surface threats, as well as to extend the range at which the Chinese Navy can impose its anti-access area denial strategy.
Okay. Now, we know China has future carrier plans. The next one perhaps is not going to be based on the Variag, and there's been all kinds of talk about whether it will have some kind of like Chinese version of the American email system, the electromagnetic catapult launch system. So what do we know about the next carrier and what that will look like?
Well, Chinese state media have already confirmed that construction of the third carrier is underway, Changqingdao shipyard near Shanghai. This is not expected to be nuclear powered, but as you pointed out, it is likely to use electromagnetic catapults to launch the embarked aircraft. Moreover, a replacement aircraft for the J-15s that are now embarked on Liaoning and Shandong is thought to be under development. So that's an interesting development there. But overall, it's fair to say that the number of carriers the Chinese Navy intends to procure remains unconfirmed. There have been Chinese commentators stating that they might have between 4 and 6 carriers in the future, but no official confirmation has emerged. I think it's important to say here that at the base south of Qingdao, which is from where Liaoning operates, construction of a second finger jetty adjacent to the first one commenced around 2015. These 2 finger jetties potentially provide 4 carrier berths near Qingdao. And with the capacity to berth 2 more carriers at Yuling, I think it's fair to say that the plan is already preparing for the expansion of its carrier force.
Okay, well, that is interesting, because if that third carrier does come into service, of course, that will make China the second most powerful carrier nation in the world. The UK has just recently commissioned its second Queen Elizabeth class carrier. Of course, we have 2 of those. But yeah, China really on the up and up with its carrier force.
Do you spend too much time collecting and processing open source information? Do you struggle to verify this information? At Janes, we deliver cutting-edge, trusted open source intelligence on current, emerging, and future threats and assessments of the capabilities you need to mitigate them. Janes is the only single resource for comprehensive, structured, and connected intelligence on military equipment, inventories, and orders of battle, which means we can help you reveal previously hidden connections. We also provide data and insight on conventional and asymmetric threats, including terrorism, extremism, and organized crime. So if you are struggling and tired of trying to develop open source intelligence with the overwhelming volumes of inconsistent and unstructured data, let us help reduce your workload. Janes assesses, validates, and verifies huge amounts of data, and then adds the insight you need to focus your resources. Visit janes.com/milcaps, that's MILCAPS, to find out more.
And lastly, I'm going to turn to Jeremy to talk a bit about Libya's strange air war. Now, in Libya, we have two factions effectively fighting for control of the country. They're both using UAVs, and Jeremy, it seems to me it's almost like mirroring that weird situation in the First World War where air warfare was relatively new and they were just learning how to use it. And you've got one squadron flying over no man's land and bombing the base of the other opposing squadrons and vice versa. And that kind of seems to be what's going on in Libya. I mean, is that how you see it?
Yeah, I think it's certainly an interesting thing because essentially we have the UAE backing the Libyan National Army faction on one side, and they're trying to capture the capital Tripoli from the government of national accord, who are backed by the Turks on the other side. So the UAE has deployed Wing Loon 2 UAVs, while the Turks have deployed Bayraktar TB2 UAVs, both of which types are armed. And then they've been trying to not only provide air support for their respective Libyan forces, but also to try and find each other's bases and take each other out. So we've just had a new UN panel of experts report has come out, and that's provided a little bit more detail on this. And according to that, citing largely LNA reports, that Turkish Bayraktars have suffered extremely high casualties. So the initial batch deployed in late May, early June, all taken out, replaced by another 8, and then probably all taken out and then replaced by another 8. This seems to be largely based on LNA claims, but the panel of experts certainly seems fairly convinced that they have suffered very high attrition out there. One of the issues that they flagged up is that the Wing Loon is actually far superior UAV. It's got a long.
It's Chinese.
It is. So essentially, the UAE was one of several original Wing Loon buyers, and as far as we can gather, they went back to the Chinese and said, we need a better one. And the Wing Loon 2 was pretty much specifically developed for the UAE, albeit it's not impossible that other customers will come forward in the future. But one of the reasons we know it's the UAE is that they're the only known Wing Loon 2 operator. So this has got a far better endurance payload, so it can carry a lot more weapons, mainly the Blue Arrow 7 missile, air-to-surface missile. But also it can be controlled using the satellite data link. In contrast, the far smaller Bayraktar TB2, indigenous Turkish design, much smaller payload, smaller bombs from Roketsan, and can only be controlled by radio control, limiting it to maybe 200 kilometers, albeit they have apparently deployed ground relay stations to extend that range a bit further to attack Jufra Air Base, which is one of the locations being used by the Wing Loon 2s. Okay. So at this stage, it's been an interesting contest and fairly one-sided, with the Wing Loon 2s being able to take out the Bayraktar TB2s on the ground. One of the issues that the UAE also has deployed air defences around the bases that it's using, making it a lot harder for the Turks to come in and bomb the Emirati UAVs on the ground. The LNA is now accusing the Turks of sending another consignment over there. We're actually seeing a ship being loaded at the moment. We got some photos of a ship being loaded in Istanbul, a roll-on, roll-off, with military equipment potentially destined for Libya to help try and repel a renewed LNA offensive. So it'll be interesting to see if we see the Bayraktars back up and running in Libya, and whether this time maybe the Turks actually do have to also deploy some sort of air defense to secure those bases, because at the moment it looks like they're just getting creamed.
Okay, well, Is there an option beyond the Bayraktars? Because the Turks have the Anchor, don't they? And that's their latest version. Is that not ready for combat? Can they not afford it?
Well, the Anchor's been in service for a while, and there are armed anchored versions, so I don't see why not. But perhaps that's a much more of an important, less disposable asset for the Turks that they don't want to lose out there, whereas they look at the Bayraktar and think, okay, that's something we can lose. There's another potential angle for that, because the people who make the Bayraktar supposedly have good links to the senior people in the Turkish government, and perhaps they're securing the contracts. And if they have to keep replacing them by building more, then
that's more business for them.
More business for them.
Perfect. Okay, well, thanks for that, Jeremy. Thanks also to Nick and Gabriel. And thanks, as always, to Josh Wales for producing. And thank you for listening.